Imagine waking up, um, grabbing your phone, and reading two breaking news alerts literally back to back.
Right.
The first alert tells you that, a massive global crisis is over, the waters are open, and the oil markets are basically throwing a massive victory party.
Yeah, everybody's celebrating.
Right. But then the second alert, detailing the exact same geopolitical standoff, outlines unprecedented military buildups, unbreakable blockades, and a situation that hasn't de-escalated by a single inch.
It's kind of wild to see them side by side.
Totally. I mean, if you are looking at your phone right now, you're probably seeing oil prices tumbling and politicians taking massive victory laps. But looking at the actual military logistics behind these headlines, those victory laps are entirely an illusion.
Oh, absolutely.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We're stripping away the confusing, contradictory narratives surrounding, honestly, one of the most critical geographic choke points on the planet, which is the Strait of Hormuz.
It is genuinely the ultimate geopolitical paradox right now. I mean, you have this massive disconnect between the diplomatic theater playing out on social media,
Yeah.
And the hard physical reality of what militaries are actually putting into the field.
Yeah, and our mission today is to just cut straight through that theater, because we're looking at a scenario where the United States and Iran are claiming utterly incompatible realities.
Completely incompatible.
Right, so we need to look past the political rhetoric, ignore the spin, and figure out what is physically happening on the ground, on the water, and critically in the global supply chains. Because the speed of the news cycle right now is just dizzying.
Oh, it's moving incredibly fast.
Yeah, I mean, Iran just declared the Strait of Hormuz officially open. Then President Trump immediately toasted that the strait will never be closed again. And the global oil market celebrated the supposed breakthrough with a staggering 12% drop in prices overnight.
What's fascinating here is that while the financial markets are treating this announcement like a finish line, the underlying mechanics tell a very, very different story.
Right? Because despite all this immediate market optimism, the reality behind the curtain involves immense, ongoing military preparations. It involves diplomatic demands from both sides that are mathematically and physically incompatible.
Yeah.
And most importantly for anyone listening to this, it involves a baked-in global economic crisis that's going to impact everything from global energy grids down to the literal cost of the food on your table over the next year.
Okay, let's unpack this illusion of agreement. Because looking through the source material, the disconnect isn't just like a minor difference in interpretation, it's structural.
Exactly.
Let's start with the Iranian narrative. So we have Iranian officials, specifically Abbas Arashi and the foreign ministry spokesman Ibrahim Alakar, laying out their terms. And look, this is not a doors wide open, global commerce is back to normal declaration.
Not at all.
The opening they announced is strictly temporary. It is entirely contingent on the ceasefire in Lebanon holding. And we all know how fragile that specific contingency is. Oh, it's extremely fragile. And even within that temporary window, Iran has attached three very specific, non-negotiable conditions.
Right, I was looking at those.
Yeah, so first, any ships passing through the strait must be purely commercial. Absolutely zero military escorts or naval vessels.
Which is a huge demand.
Right. Second, the ships and their cargo cannot be linked to any nation they designate as a belligerent state. And third, and this is the real physical reality check here, because there are active naval mines deployed in the water, ships are required to pass through highly specific, narrow routes designated by Iran.
So they have to navigate a literal minefield.
Exactly. Everything has to be visually and electronically coordinated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. They are effectively acting as the sole harbor masters of the strait.
Wow. Which brings us to the U.S. counter-narrative. Because you have President Trump aggressively pushing back on reports, specifically that recent Axios report, which suggested the U.S. was unfreezing $20 billion in Iranian assets.
Right, the alleged deal.
Yeah, the deal where Iran would hand over 400-plus kilograms of 60% reprocessed nuclear material in exchange for that money. The president took to social media to emphatically deny this, calling the material nuclear dust and insisting the U.S. will pay absolutely nothing.
And we really need to clarify why that 60% number is so critical, because it is definitely not just dust.
Right.
In the world of nuclear physics, enriching uranium to 60% is by far the hardest part of the process. Once you hit 60, you are at the critical threshold. Pushing that material to 90%, weapons grade is a relatively short, straightforward sprint.
So it's basically on the 1 yard line.
Precisely. So that 400 kilograms of 60% enriched material isn't just some bargaining chip. It's essentially a loaded gun resting on the negotiating table.
Okay, so the president denies paying for it, insists the U.S. naval blockade will remain entirely in place, and claims Iran has unconditionally promised to never close the strait again.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at these two sets of demands, it's like two opposing lawyers standing on the courthouse steps, both holding press conferences claiming they won a massive total victory. But looking at the actual court documents, they are arguing two completely different cases.
Yet from an analytical standpoint, it is a complete stalemate masked as a breakthrough. I mean, the Iranian Foreign Ministry has drawn a very hard line. They view the continuation of any U.S. blockade as a direct violation of the Lebanon ceasefire.
Yeah, the terminology they used in the sources was very clear.
Exactly. They're calling it a situation that must be a two-way street or a no-way street. Meanwhile, the U.S. is demanding complete compliance from Iran open waters while maintaining maximum economic and naval pressure.
I was looking at the translated media reports out of Tehran, and you can see this mindset manifesting physically in their cities. There's this recurring billboard campaign going up across Tehran right now, featuring a giant stylized hand firmly gripping the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, I saw that.
That isn't just domestic propaganda, that is a direct communication of their perceived leverage. They are broadcasting that they control the physical valve of the global economy.
Exactly. Which, frankly, brings us to a major contradiction in the source material. If diplomats are supposedly working behind the scenes, and both sides are publicly dropping phrases about open waters and ceasefires, we have to ask why the highest levels of the U.S. defense apparatus are simultaneously stating that the military is locked and loaded.
I really want to dig into that. Because looking at the satellite imagery and the deployment logs from the sources, the U.S. isn't just maintaining a defensive posture here.
No, not at all.
They are completely restructuring their regional footprint. The military is surging air traffic and dramatically increasing the naval fleet in the region.
The scale of the U.S. military preparation is immense. And the specific types of hardware they are moving into the theater, well, it tells you exactly what kind of conflict they're anticipating.
Right.
They are radically restocking interceptor and offensive missiles. We're talking about surging SM-3s, which are advanced interceptors designed to knock high-altitude ballistic missiles out of the sky.
Which obviously indicates they are expecting a massive incoming barrage from Iran's mainland.
Precisely. And on the offensive side, they are positioning Tomahawks and JSSMs.
Oh, wait, JSSMs?
Yeah, a JSSM, a Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, is not a generic bomb. It is a highly stealthy, precision cruise missile specifically engineered to bust open deeply fortified targets.
Wow.
You bring JSSMs into a theater when you are planning to crack open mountain bunkers. President Trump explicitly told reporters that when this temporary ceasefire period ends, hostilities would resume.
Which is wild.
Yeah. The political wing might be using this as negotiation pressure, but the military logistics branch is undeniably treating it as a literal order to prepare for a major kinetic conflict.
And observing the intelligence reports, Iran is executing its own massive concurrent buildup. They aren't just sitting around waiting.
Right.
Open source intelligence indicates they are heavily excavating new tunnel systems in the mountains and expanding their underground missile cities. The sources specifically mention they are cross-leveling assets.
Yeah, and that cross-leveling tactic is crucial to understand. Iran isn't just hiding missiles in isolated caves. They have built a massive subterranean highway system.
Right.
By constantly shifting these ballistic missiles and launchers through interconnected underground tunnels, U.S. and allied satellite intelligence can never get a fixed lock on where the actual threat is at any given minute.
So it's like a giant underground shell game.
Exactly. If a strike package is ordered on Tunnel A, the missile launcher has already been driven 3 miles underground to Tunnel B. It makes neutralizing their offensive capabilities from the air nearly impossible.
Which really makes you wonder, right? With the U.S. surging bunker busters and Iran digging deeper into the mountains, why is Iran so unyielding? If the economic pain of the blockade is as severe as reported, why wouldn't Iran just take a negotiated deal to relieve the pressure?
Well, to understand their absolute refusal to compromise, we have to look back at the psychological shift that occurred after the Israeli attack in 2025.
Operation Midnight Hammer.
Right, Operation Midnight Hammer. That single event profoundly altered Tehran's strategic calculus. The intelligence assessments indicate that Iran concluded from that attack that trusting Western powers or showing any kind of self-restraint is strategically fatal.
Interesting.
Yeah, in their prevailing military doctrine, capitulation doesn't buy peace. It merely allows the adversary to reload and encourages further, more devastating attacks down the line.
Ah, I see.
So they firmly believe they must maintain maximum leverage holding onto their 60% enriched material, keeping the active threat of closing the strait, because surrendering those cards leaves them completely defenseless.
Okay, so the rhetoric has basically failed. Both militaries are physically gearing up for the worst-case scenario. If this actually boils over and hostilities resume, what does that practically look like? Because you hear political commentators casually throwing around the idea of a U.S. ground invasion to force a regime change. But looking at the topography of the region, that seems like a total geographical nightmare.
Oh, a ground invasion of Iran is the absolute definition of a geographic trap. It is, for all practical purposes, a military impossibility for the current U.S. force structure.
Wow, really?
Yeah, to even mount a credible threat of taking the capital or occupying major nuclear sites, defense analysts estimate you would need an invasion force of roughly 400,000 to 500,000 troops.
Just to put that in perspective for you listening, that is roughly 3 times the size of the initial U.S. invasion force that entered Iraq in 2003. And Iraq was largely flat desert terrain.
Right.
Iran is a completely different beast.
It is. The sheer scale of the country is something that routinely gets lost in these conversations. I mean, Iran is roughly the size of a massive portion of Western Europe.
Yeah.
But it's the terrain that makes it an unconquerable fortress. The entire western border of the country is shielded by the Zagros Mountains.
Right.
And these aren't just rolling hills. This is a 900-mile wall of jagged rock, deep ravines, and extreme elevations. There are virtually no viable wide routes for a modern mechanized army to roll through.
Because they have that massive logistical tail, right? The fuel trucks and supply lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Any advancing column would be forced into incredibly narrow passes. It is a defensive commander's absolute dream scenario.
Okay, what about approaching from the other side? We have military proximity to Afghanistan on Iran's eastern border. Could an invasion force push in from the east?
Well, even if you manage the massive logistical hurdle of flying hundreds of thousands of troops and their heavy armor into the eastern theater, the terrain there funnels any advancing force into constricted, highly predictable valleys.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it would become an immediate gauntlet. An invading mechanized army would be forced into a miles-long shooting gallery with Iranian asymmetrical forces holding the elevated, fortified high ground on both sides of the valley. The casualty rates would be staggering.
So a massive, sweeping World War II-style invasion is physically off the table. But what about a smaller, more surgical approach? Because the sources mention debates over targeted raids. For example, U.S. Marines taking control of Karg Island, which handles the vast majority of Iran's oil exports. Or maybe seizing a coastal city like Bandar Abbas to establish a beachhead.
Taking a point target on the coast is certainly within the capabilities of the U.S. military. The problem is holding it.
Ah, right.
The strategy of seizing a small pocket of territory in a massive hostile nation draws a very direct comparison to Ukraine's Kursk offensive into Russia.
That's a really revealing comparison. Explain why Kursk is the model for how this fails.
So, in the Kursk offensive, Ukrainian forces successfully pushed in and took Russian territory. It was a brilliant temporary tactical success.
Right.
But strategically, it became a massive liability. When you take a small piece of land surrounded by a massive hostile nation with deep reserves, your forces become a dead man walking.
Because they just get cut off.
Exactly. You extend your own supply lines, while the defending country, in this case Iran, can just surround that pocket and slowly, methodically squeeze the position down using overwhelming artillery and missile fire.
So if the U.S. took Karg Island,
they would be placing elite units onto a tiny speck of land surrounded by thousands of hidden Iranian anti-ship and ballistic missiles. The cost in lives and naval vessels to defend that tiny patch of rock would be profound, and the long-term strategic gain would be zero because the position is completely untenable.
Wow. Okay, so if a ground war is geographically impossible and holding small pockets of coastal territory is a strategic dead end, what are the actual levers left for the Oval Office? Because walking through the remaining options based on the source material, they all seem politically or economically catastrophic.
They are. Impartially speaking, the current U.S. administration is staring down 3 distinct paths, and none of them represent a clean victory.
Okay.
The first path is a negotiated settlement.
Which essentially means capitulating to Iran's long-standing 10-point plan, right?
Precisely. It would mean giving Iran terms they find acceptable. That likely includes allowing them to operate a literal or figurative toll booth for the Strait of Hormuz, meaning the IRGC maintains sovereign authority over who passes.
Oh, wow.
It would also mean allowing them to keep their proxy networks and massive ballistic missile forces completely intact and fully unfreezing their global assets. For any U.S. administration, choosing this path means having to eat a massive amount of crow domestically. It would be viewed politically as a total surrender.
Which is likely political suicide in Washington right now. So if a negotiated settlement is off the table, that pushes the administration toward a kinetic response. Basically, option B, a massive bombing campaign.
Right, the double-down approach. This would involve a massive, sustained firestorm campaign targeting Iran's energy grid, their oil refineries, and their critical infrastructure from the air.
But the intelligence sources are crystal clear on the consequence of this action, too. Iran has unequivocally promised to respond in kind.
Yes, they have.
They have stated they will instantly target the energy infrastructure of the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council, meaning Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, as well as Israel and U.S. military assets scattered across the region.
Yeah, and if this firestorm scenario happens, Iran's retaliation essentially turns the lights out on the global oil industry for an extended, unpredictable period.
Which brings us to the third path, Operation Economic Fury. The long game.
Right.
The U.S. maintains the naval blockade indefinitely, layers on crippling new secondary sanctions, and simply tries to see who can suffer the economic pain the longest. But looking at the ship tracking data in our sources, I really have to challenge the premise that this blockade is actually working.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the official U.S. narrative is that the blockade is an impenetrable wall and that they've successfully turned back 13 or 14 sanctioned ships.
This is exactly where you have to separate government statements from physical data. If you look at the recent fast-motion ship tracker data, the actual automatic identification system, or AIS transponders, of vessels moving in and out of the Gulf over the final days of the blockade, it tells a completely contradictory story.
The ships are spoofing their locations, right?
They're spoofing their transponders, going completely dark electronically, and physically slipping past the blockade lines.
Unbelievable.
The satellite data shows numerous U.S.-sanctioned ships escaping the Gulf undetected by the official dragnet. So relying on a naval blockade that is highly porous to slowly starve out a regime that has spent 40 years building a resistance economy, well, it is a massive gamble.
Here's where it gets really interesting, at least for you listening to this right now.
Yeah.
Because this geopolitical chess match stops being an abstract theory and starts impacting your actual wallet. We need to circle back to that 12% drop in global oil prices we mentioned at the start of the deep dive.
Right, the victory party.
Yeah. The markets threw a party, but based on the physical mechanics of the global supply chain, that price drop is a complete mirage.
It is entirely a mirage.
Yeah.
You can't just hit the gas pedal and expect a miles-long global freight train to instantly hit top speed. The global supply chain does not operate like a light switch.
Yeah.
Even if a miraculous, permanent, ironclad peace treaty was signed this very afternoon, you cannot simply have oil flowing at full capacity tomorrow morning. It takes months to restart tanker flows.
Oh, because of the insurance layer.
Exactly. Major maritime insurance syndicates, like Lloyd's of London, have to independently assess the risk, remove the war risk designation, and lower premiums to a point where cargo carriers can actually afford to sail.
And there is a massive physical bottleneck sitting in the desert right now, too. The sources note that during the height of this crisis, 5 out of the 6 GCC countries had to physically suspend pulling oil out of the ground. They literally had to cap their wells.
Because they completely ran out of physical storage space. The massive storage tanks were full, the tanker ships weren't moving through the strait, so the entire pipeline backed up to the source.
Right.
And capping an oil well isn't like turning off a faucet in your kitchen. It requires managing immense subterranean pressure. And bringing those wells back online takes highly specialized engineering and weeks of time.
Wow.
Undoing that logistical nightmare, emptying the storage, getting the pipelines flowing, getting the massive tankers loaded, insured, and safely navigating through previously mined waters. It will take many, many months before the flow returns to anything resembling pre-crisis levels.
And oil is just the first domino to fall. If you look at the research, the ripple effect into global agriculture is genuinely terrifying. This isn't just about what it costs to fill up your gas tank. It is fundamentally about the global food supply.
Yeah, if you track the commodities linked to this specific region, you are looking at massive disruptions in natural gas, diesel, and critically fertilizer.
Fertilizer, right.
Natural gas is the primary feedstock for creating urea, which is the base of commercial fertilizer. There is a dangerous lag effect happening right now in global agriculture that the general public won't see at the grocery store for another 6 to 8 months.
Break the mechanics of that lag effect down. How does that actually work?
Right now, today, farmers in the American Midwest, in Asia, in the Philippines, and Australia, they are in the middle of their critical planting seasons.
Okay.
But because of this geopolitical crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, the cost of diesel to run their heavy equipment has skyrocketed. More importantly, they are planting right now with severely scarce, heavily overpriced fertilizer.
So because the input costs are astronomical, they are physically applying less fertilizer to the soil.
Exactly. And when you apply less fertilizer today, the corn stalks grow thinner, the wheat yields drop by 20 to 30%, and the harvest fails. The geopolitics of today, the stalled ships, the diplomatic gridlock, the spoof transponders, are going to physically manifest as severe global food scarcity in the fall. When those crops finally come out of the ground months from now, the overall global yield will be dramatically lower, and the cost to produce them will have been astronomically higher.
And that scarcity carries over.
Mm.
It means bread prices in Asia spike, it means livestock feed in the U.S. becomes unaffordable, and the pain stretches deep into the next planting season. The pain is literally already in the mail.
It is.
Economists looking at this specific lag effect are warning that a global recession isn't just a possibility anymore. It's practically baked into the system due to the compounding delayed effects of these energy and agricultural disruptions.
Yeah.
And if we revert to that double-down kinetic military option we discussed earlier, a return to full hostilities, we aren't just looking at a recession. We are looking at the very real mathematical possibility of a global depression.
Which brings us back to the core reality of this situation. You have the optimistic words of politicians trying to manage optics, calm domestic populations, and stabilize financial markets.
Right.
And on the other side, you have the harsh, unforgiving realities of military logistics, insurmountable geographic traps in the Zagros Mountains, and incredibly fragile global supply chains.
Yeah.
Regardless of the political spin you hear on the nightly news, there is no magical victory narrative available that avoids global economic pain. The consequences of this standoff are already flowing through the system.
It really leaves you with a sobering perspective on how fragile everything is. When a single narrow stretch of water and the mere threat of naval mines deployed within it can directly dictate the cost of fertilizer in the American Midwest and ultimately determine the availability and price of food in Asia many months down the line, well, it forces you to ask a really uncomfortable question. Is our modern, hyper-connected, globalized economy actually a marvel of human efficiency? Or is it just a massive, precarious house of cards waiting for a single gust of wind from the Strait of Hormuz to bring the whole thing crashing down?
It's a vulnerability we've engineered ourselves into, honestly, and untangling it'll take years, not a single press conference.
That is exactly why we need to keep looking past the alerts on our phones and understanding the mechanics beneath the headlines. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives, look for the reality behind the rhetoric, and we'll see you next time.